Lehman, Fannie Mae, Wachovia, Barclays, JP Morgan Chase, AIG, Goldman Sachs, just a few of the companies that Rodgin Cohen has advised. I sat down with the real-life Rodgin Cohen to talk about life after the credit crisis, but started by asking him if movies such as Too Big to Fail or the Oscar-winning documentary Inside Job fairly or unfairly portray Dick Fuld and other execs as angry, greedy tycoons.
I think that some of these portrayals have been unfair because, at least in all of my contacts with Dick, which really started shortly after Bear Stearns' failure, he truly recognized the jeopardy that Lehman was in, and there were extensive efforts throughout the summer to find a merger partner.
We know the Koreans were one group who were very interested, and in Too Big to Fail, as soon as Dick Fuld walks in, it seems like the Koreans lose interest. Is that cinematography, or is that the way you think it could have happened?
I think, in fairness, that's more cinematography than reality. I was not at that meeting, but there were real questions about whether the Koreans could pull off a transaction of that magnitude. After all, Lehman was much larger than most of the institutions in Korea that were involved. And if you think about it, the British government had a problem with a really first-class bank, Barclays, buying Lehman. None of the Korean institutions was of Barclays' stature, and at the end of the day, would the Korean government have permitted one or some conglomerate of its institutions to buy Lehman? We'll never really know. But I don't see this as Dick Fuld scotching the Korean deal. That was a very difficult deal, and Dick really did try to generate interest elsewhere.
New York Times called you the trauma surgeon of Wall Street. You've been involved in a lot of stressful situations, one of them political in nature when you negotiated with the banks to free the Iranian hostages. How does the credit crisis compare in stress terms to some of the other experiences, the other boilerplate incidences that you've been in?
Clearly, the most stressful and ultimately the most exhilarating was the Iranian hostage crisis, because we were talking about people's lives in a very real sense. But with that exception, the financial crisis of '08 just dwarfed everything else. 2008 was the whole financial system, and it was global, not just domestic.
Who do you think will be held responsible? Some people have said Angelo Mozilo, the fact that he's not in jail is a surprise. Will we see any kind of criminal charges?
I think it is possible, but I would really offer 2 points here. One, the effort really should be to search for solutions rather than villains. And second, there is an understandable reaction, which is to confuse stupidity, even gross stupidity, with criminality. They are not the same things.
So if criminal prosecution is unlikely, what about civil?
Certainly there are civil actions ongoing in a number of situations, and I think those are likely to continue.
Post-crisis, the numerous issues for banks include just how much capital they need to ensure a safe financial system. Banks are lobbying to limit how much capital they're required to hold. JP Morgan Chase CEO Jamie Dimon publicly questioned Fed Chair Ben Bernanke over it. Regulators such as FDIC Chairman Sheila Bair, Fed Reserve Board Governor Dan Tarullo making the case for more cash on the balance sheets. Now, Sullivan Cromwell represents 17 of the so-called clearinghouse banks. When I asked Raj what the right amount for banks is, this is what he told me. He said all banks have already doubled their capital requirements from what they had pre-crisis, which was too low. But he says some of what's been suggested could run the risk of having an adverse effect on the U.S. economy. And because of the fragility of the economy, it would be foolish to do so now. The New York Times called Rodgin Cohen the trauma surgeon of Wall Street, but banks are not the only businesses that tap Cohen's legendary negotiating and problem-solving skills. Harvey Weinstein of the Weinstein Company read of Cohen's advisory role in almost every major bank deal during the credit crisis and decided that was the person to contact when the Weinstein Company was in trouble. I asked Raj what the initial conversation was like.
as I remember it, he called me and said, my name is Harvey Weinstein and I make movies. And I said, actually, I know who you are because my son is in film school.
What was it like working with him? I mean, anyone who has says he's as big a character as you can imagine.
Well, he is a big character, but he is also a very skillful evaluator of how to deal with people, knowing when to push, when not to push. And I think he also has a fair amount, more than a fair amount, of self-realization. And I think he realizes that his strength is making movies, which he's obviously great at. And it's perhaps best to leave the business side to a substantial extent to people with a lot of business expertise.
You helped the Weinstein Company erase its debt.
It was a complex restructuring. I think this was a case where everybody saw the value in an ongoing company rather than some sort of forced liquidation. As always, everybody wants to get as much as you can, but everybody came to the table with a sense of realism ultimately, and that enabled the restructuring to occur.
Rodgin Cohen told me there are plenty of similarities in his work between helping banks and what he did at the Weinstein Company. Here's what he said about the differences.
I think only that it becomes much more one of individuals, with the Weinstein companies being Harvey and Bob, and that they are a bit larger than life.
Well, they chased but didn't land Miramax. From a business point of view, is that the best case scenario?
I think, and we were not deeply involved, but I think looking at the price paid, yes, I think it would have been a mistake to have continued to bid up.
He has a reputation of biting off more than he can chew. Do you think this was a cautionary tale, or do you think he's going to go forward as he was before?
I think it's a cautionary tale which he read and understood. And I have heard him say a number of times that what he now wants to do is focus on making movies. And if you look at A King's Speech, you can understand.
4 Oscar wins probably restored the mojo.
It did.